I'm delighted to welcome John Gimlet to talk about us today. John and I go back a while, actually. I was checking it, John, and I think I met you about 18 years ago at some Latin American Travel Association do. And when, I don't know what books you were writing then. And then I think we helped you out with a trip to Peru a few years later, where you did a combination of severe camping and severe luxury at Orient Express or something like that, which was great. But anyway, so it's lovely to have you here. And then you wrote, of course, that fantastic book on Paraguay, and then your one on Guyana, which was an absolute pleasure to read. So for anyone who doesn't know John, and I know there are a few here who do, his day job is as a lawyer. Most of us in travel need day jobs. And he's written 6 books, I think now, on travel, which is his passion, and must have traveled to most countries in the world, I guess. Anyway, his latest book is Gardens of Mars. It's all about Madagascar, and John's just going to talk us through a few wonderful slides, which I've already seen, I admit, and we very much look forward to hearing from you, John. And then what I would suggest is, if anyone's got a question as we go along, could you write it in the chat, please? And I will put those questions to John at the end. So, John, over to you.
Ed, thank you very much for that lovely welcome. And it's great to be back, as it were. And welcome to all of you to Madagascar in the literary sense, at any rate. And welcome to Gardens of Mars, which is my latest book. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about Madagascar, about my journey, and about what it all means to me. And one of the first things I'm always asked is, how did you first come to Madagascar? We could have the first slide. And the answer is that back in 2004, I was writing an article for one of the broadsheets, and I went out to Madagascar to do this article, mostly about luxury hotels and so on. And I went with my wife. Now, it's a measure of how ignorant I was of Madagascar at that time, that she was 4 months pregnant at the time. Now, Madagascar's medical services are skeletal at the best of times, but back then in 2004, they were almost non-existent. Even today, there's only one CT scanner in the whole country, and I think no neurosurgeon at all. Anyway, fortunately, there weren't any antenatal adventures, and we bounced from lovely hotel to lovely hotel, from beautiful beaches to beautiful beaches, and there were gorgeous creatures all along the way. And I came away from the trip absolutely enchanted, but, well, none the wiser, really. And over the next 15 years or so, I was increasingly intrigued by this island and started to build up a body of research, and then off I went for a 3-month trip around the island. Now, the first thing you've got to understand about Madagascar is that it's absolutely vast. If you were to lay it on a map of Europe, it would stretch from London to Algiers. And yet, within that vast, vast space, it has a road network that is about the same as Jamaica's. In other words, 21,000 kilometers. And so, well, we know that Jamaica is just like a dot on the world map. So Madagascar isn't just huge, it's also very difficult to access. Now, when the first Arabs came to this island, first Arab traders came to the island, they called it the Island of the Moon. And I always think that if they'd gone inland and seen how rich and diverse and how forested and red and strange it all is, then they would have called it the Gardens of Mars. And that's the title of the book. Now, the other thing to understand about Madagascar is that if you were to look at it in cross-section, it would look rather like a sort of wedge, I suppose. And over in the west, it's dry and very, very hot. And over in the east, it's got this very steep escarpment leading down to the coast. And there it's very wet, very forested and very steep. And it can rain up to 15 inches of rain in an hour. Anyway, next slide, please. So that's a picture from an aeroplane of the south of Madagascar. And you get some idea of the dryness and the heat of the place and this sort of, if you like, a Martian landscape. Next, please. So I set off on my journey, covering about 380 kilometers by boat along the Sarabandina River and also through a canal system. Next, please. But most of the way, I traveled by road, and I covered some 5,500 kilometers by Taxi Bruce. That's the local minibuses. It's a great way to travel. It's a great way to commune with the locals, but these are long 18-hour journeys. Next, please. And during this journey, there were moments of pure joy and wonder, embarrassment, and also terror. And let me just start with that frightening instance. It's this, the 21st of April, 2018. And there was a demonstration in the capital, Antananarivo. And everybody said to me, you really should go to it because you need to see it and you need to report on it. And so I did. And as I was watching this demonstration, things started getting pretty ugly. Tear gas started flying, and then the army opened fire. And in what followed, 3 people were shot dead and 80 were injured. And I have to say that for me, the whole ordeal was absolutely terrifying, but, and I feel almost guilty saying this, also very exhilarating, because here I was seeing something that I should be seeing, reporting on something that I should be talking about, and being part of Malagasy history as it was happening. It is a day I'll never forget. But anyway, you don't want to hear much more about that right now. You want to know about the embarrassing moment. And yes, next slide, please. It finds me in my underpants. And the story here is that I was right down on the south coast of Madagascar, following up a story about a shipwreck in 1703. And what happened during this shipwreck is about 130 Europeans survived the wreck and came ashore only to be murdered by the local tribesmen in the dunes that you can see in this picture. Now, it's a very difficult spot to access. It took me days to get there, and then it's a 7-kilometer walk through the dunes to get to this river. And then, of course, I get to the river, and I'm with a whole lot of villagers, and I can't get any further. So I say to them, well, I need to get to the other side of the river because that's where I'm trying to get to, these dunes. And they say, well, that's fine, we'll just walk. So we had to strip off, and I put all my stuff in my pack, and off we went. And of course, word pretty soon went round amongst the locals, and this was about as wide as the Thames at this point, but never deeper than sort of waist deep. By the time I got to the other side, they'd all assembled, particularly the washerwomen, and I don't think they'd ever seen anything quite so exotic as this sort of strange white figure wading out of the water in a state of semi-undress. I should think they're probably still talking about it even today. Next, please. Anyway, a very curious journey unfolded. And one of the things that I'd never really understood about Madagascar from all my researches is that there is this state of low-grade warfare going on all the time in the countryside. And what it is, it's the rustlers, those who would steal some of the 11 million cattle there against the villagers. And to defend their cattle, the villagers set up these militia called Kaloon, and you can see 2 militiamen in these pictures. And they fight the gangs. The gangs are big. They're up to 80 strong, and they have funny names like Funky Lima or something like that. And they're armed with Kalashnikovs and spears and some of the homemade guns that you can see in the bottom right picture. And the villagers go after them. And you will see people literally manhunting in the countryside as you're going around. Large groups of militiamen like these guys. And I said to them, what do you do when you catch the Dahal, the gangsters, the rustlers? And they said, well, we kill them, because if we hand them over to the police, they will pay a bribe and they'll come after us. So we douse them in petrol and we burn them, and that's it. And this always surprised me, this idea that there's this sort of low-grade medieval warfare going on all the time in the remotest rural parts of Madagascar. And it's nothing to be frightened of, because they are not interested in tourists. Visitors play no part in this. At the heart of this sort of battle, as it were, is cattle. Next slide, please. And the other really strange thing, which again I never really appreciated before going, is the worship of the dead. So ancestor worship is so important to Malagasys. And if you're wealthy enough, what you do is every year or every 5 years, or depending, you have this sort of ceremony where you dig up granny and grandfather, clean off the bones, unwrap the silk, take them around the village, show them what's happened in the village since they died, and then there's a party, lots of drink, lots of meat and rice and so on. And it's a bit like a wedding for a dead person. It's a very curious thing. But this goes right to the heart of what Malagasys believe in, this worship of the dead and ancestors. And central to all of this is the family tomb. Families will spend more on their tomb than they will on their house. It's a far more important place. It's a portal to the afterlife. And you have to make sure that you are near the tomb, so that if you die, you have access to the tomb. You go through to the other world. You're in big trouble if you're abroad or living a long way from this portal, as it were. And this reverence for the dead and the ancestors affects also the way they think. So you can't do anything that your ancestors may have disapproved of. So it makes Malagasy very conservative, as well as immobile, because they won't go anywhere. It even affects Parliament and the decisions that they make. They have to be consistent with ancestral belief, otherwise they are fumba. In other words, they are not with custom and so on. It's a real restriction, as it were, on Malagasy society. Next, please. So the surprises continue throughout politics. There are 200 political parties in Madagascar, including one called the Western Malagasy Slaves. And they dress up in cowboy outfits, including Stetsons and plaid shirts and so on. And they are great admirers of the spaghetti westerns of the 1970s. And that's what they kind of model themselves on. And then there's another political party who are a sort of the Kung Fu party. And they're really for aristocrats. Anyway, most surprising perhaps, next please, is the tomb art, the erotic art of the South. And this is one example you can see in this picture here. And this is not pornography. What it is something that's actually very beautiful art, and it symbolizes death turning into procreation, this complicated idea that as you leave this earth, you're replaced by another living body. So this idea of erotic art is very, very important to them. Now, unfortunately, a lot of it gets stolen. And particularly in the 60s and 70s, dealers came over from the West and really ransacked the Sakalava world, that's the world of the Western Madagascar, and stole a lot of this statuary. And it ended up on the art markets in New York and in London. And a sculpture like this one that you see here would probably set you back about $100,000 if you were able to find one at auction in New York. And sadly, that means that there are very few that you can find in Western Madagascar. I was lucky to find this one. The picture on the right, on the other side, is interesting as well. It's a lot of biros planted in the ground underneath a holy tree. And the idea here is that students come along and they plant a biro in the ground under the tree, and it gives them good luck in their exams. So again, you just see this all the time. You get this idea of magic and amulets and sorcery. Witch doctors are a very important part of life, particularly when you get out to the dry Western areas. Next, please. Now, of course, no mention of Madagascar would be complete without some discussion of the wildlife. It is, of course, one of the most remarkable features of this island. Something like 91% of the animals that live here are endemic. And of the 170 species of mammals to be found here, only one, the bats, are to be found anywhere else in the world. So that means you get these remarkable, unusual creatures that you've never seen anywhere else, including this one that you see in the image here. It's called, it looks like Fusa, it's pronounced Fus. And the Fus is an incredible animal. Nobody likes it. It's so ugly. It's a sort of cross between a dog and a mongoose. It's ugly, it steals things, it comes and turns over dustbins, and it's vicious. It sort of attacks everything that it comes across. But I must say, I've got a bit of a soft spot for it. Anyway, next, please. And then, of course, there are the lemurs that make Madagascar so famous. There are now 107 species of lemur on the island. I say now because, of course, they've been speciating over the last 40 million years when they first arrived on Madagascar. And they've speciated in such a way that the smallest of them is big enough to fit inside a teacup, and the largest of them is about the size of a 3-year-old human being. So there's an enormous, rich variety of these wonderful creatures. Next, please. But I think probably my favorite spectacle in Madagascar is the humpback whales. And for this, you've got to go to St. Mary's Island, or Ile Saint-Marie. And what happens is every year at a certain time of year, we were there in August, about thousands and thousands of these lovely creatures come swimming up from the Antarctic, 5,000 miles away, and they come here to calf and to mate. And it makes the water around the island like a sort of a mixture between a sort of orgy and a sort of Glastonbury for whales. They're so exuberant and so happy to see each other, and they show off and they jump out of the water. And that's quite a sight when you think that these animals are about the size of 2 London buses. So you're really in for an unbelievable spectacle when you're there. Next, please. Now, to the people that live there, these animals are very often something of a mystery. Most people, for example, in Madagascar have never seen a lemur, particularly in the big cities. And for them, it's a bit of a mystery why us Europeans and Westerners are so interested in lemurs. It's a bit the equivalent of, let's say, aliens, rich aliens, arriving in Britain and demanding to see the pine martens. Madagascars just don't get it. Why do you want to see our lemurs? Meanwhile, the other animals are treated either as little gods or maybe lunch. It's a sad sight sometimes to see roasted creatures, including lemurs, in some of the marketplaces around the country. And I'm afraid that's part of the slow degradation of this country that one often sees. Next, please. Now, my journey, in a way, took its own course, because what I was doing was plotting a way through Malagasy history. And to start at the beginning, I went over to the west, which is the driest, hottest part of the country, and looks almost burnt, like a sort of newborn planet. And that all started, or rather Madagascar started as an independent island, as it were, about 100 million years ago, when India and Sri Lanka sheared off and headed north, crashing into Asia and forming, of course, the Himalayas. That left Madagascar by itself, and it evolved in its own way. Humans appeared very, very late in the scene, only about 10,000 years ago. Okay, next, please. And the really remarkable thing is that the settlers that came out on top, the most successful settlers, didn't come from Africa, 240 miles in that direction, but all the way across the Indian Ocean, 3,700 miles away in Borneo. And they brought with them basketry. You can see from this lady's hat a good example of that, rice culture, iron smelting, and of course, a worship of the dead. Next, please. Now, all of this was bad news for the larger lumpen creatures that lurched around this island. enormous giant lemurs, and my favorite of all, the elephant bird. Now, the elephant bird stood 10 feet tall, and its egg, which you can see in this picture here, I'm holding it in fact, is big enough to make 150 omelets. Imagine that as a breakfast. Now, the elephant bird probably became extinct in around about 1200, probably because mankind, the new mankind as it were, was burning off the land or possibly hunting them. But it's not quite the end of the elephant bird, because if you go down to the south coast, which is very remote, very empty and ringed with dunes, up in the dunes you will find tons and tons of eggshell, each piece like a broken bit of dinner plate. And that's what remains of these obviously magnificent birds. Next, please. Now, the Asians, these Borneo people thrived in Africa. And you know they thrived because it's their language that dominates the island. And it's worth saying something about Malagasy. It's a very, very difficult language. Diplomats are often excused from learning it. But it is identical, almost, to a language in South Borneo. In fact, one can even identify the part of South Borneo. It's the Barito Valley. And there's a congruency of 81% between the words of Malagasy and the words of this little valley, sort of a third of the way, right the way the other side of the Indian Ocean. And of these Indians, one tribe began to dominate, and they're called the Merina or Main, and they're from the highlands of Madagascar. Now, next slide, please. Now, to understand the Merina, you almost have to be a bird. You have to get above the highlands and look down to get some sense of their ambition. And you'll see the highlands are covered in this ingenious system of irrigation and rice culture, terraces, just like you'd see in the Philippines or Thailand or anywhere else like that. You'll also see from the air, and you can see it in this picture here. You can see one right in the center of the picture, these round forts, perfectly round forts with ditches about 15 feet deep. And these are all over the highlands. The early Merina have also left us with something else, and that's a class system. It's a class system that exists today with two very, very prominent structures within that class system. One is the aristocratic class, and the other is the lowest class, who are still known as literally the slaves. Next, please. Now, at the same time, or perhaps a little bit before, Arabs were beginning to settle around the coast, setting up ports and entrepôts for their trading. And they brought with them cattle, they brought with them Africans from continental Africa, and with them came the language of Bantu, and of course, they brought with them some of their traditions, and the Arabs also themselves brought with them arithmetic and astrology. And with all of that came something else, and that is slavery. Slavery would dominate the scene from then on, and you get the first Malagasy slaves appearing in the market in Zanzibar in about the 11th century. Next, please. So during this period, more Africans come from continental Africa, and no one, again, really knows how they came or when they came. But they have created another part of the political scene, which is divided between the Highlanders on the one side, Asian-looking, predominantly Asian-looking, and the Côtiers, the people from the coast, who were predominantly African-looking. And the Africans have brought on all their own ceremonies and traditions. And one of my favorite of them is this. It's called merengue, and it's a form of wrestling, but it's different from our wrestling because each bout lasts about 20 or 30 seconds. And the idea is you have to try and overwhelm your opponent with extraordinary force. And almost anything goes, kicking, punching, slapping, grabbing, hair, anything, and you've just got to bring them to some sort of defeat within that 30 seconds or so. It is quite extraordinary sport to watch. Next, please. Anyway, so around 1610, we're going, I know, go back to the center of the island now, to Tanna. And around that time, this powerful tribe, the Merina, the Asian tribe, begin to burst out of the highland and expand across the islands. And it's a period of warfare and slavery that will really last for the next 300 years. And during that time, the Merina will bring 1 million slaves back to Tanna, creating the society, the mixed society today of Asian and African blood. Also, the legacy from that period is not only these remarkable ditches, you see, but also forts, huge forts, the sort of donut shaped really, with walls made with up to 16 million eggs. And the egg white is used to create this sort of Malagasy concrete that seems to last forever, really. And sometimes within these forts, you will also find Napoleonic cannon. And what happened here is these were given to the Malagasy kings by the British under a treaty in 1817. And it's all sort of army surplus left over from the Napoleonic War, but it's still there in the forts and was still used throughout most of the 20th century. Okay, next please. So the Merina dominate the 19th century across Madagascar. And the Europeans really don't make any foothold at all, with a few exceptions. And one of them is this. This is some Breton shipbuilders who arrived in a port, a little tiny port in the west of Madagascar, and started building schooners and teaching the locals. And the locals still make them there to an 1865 pattern, and they're perfectly adapted for trading all along the west coast of Madagascar because they can easily get into the shallow water. Now, the other foreign import at this time was God, and God was brought to Madagascar by the Welsh. Between 1820 and 1830, a mere 10 Welsh missionaries, 3 of them from the same tiny, tiny school in Cardigan, introduced Christianity to Madagascar. First, they had to learn the language, no mean feat, a lot of diplomats still can't do it. Then they translated the New Testament into Malagasy. Then they printed it and disseminated Bibles such that by the end of that 10-year period, 250,000 Malagasys had been converted, setting the course for the rest of the 19th century and into the 20th century, making Madagascar, as I say, one of the most Christian countries in the world. Next, please. So only in 1895 is Madagascar finally conquered by outsiders. And it is, of course, the French. And the French fought a desperate campaign. And in order to follow what happened, I had to travel 500 miles by taxi brousse out to Majunga and then follow this sort of ghostly trail back. And really madness follows at this point because the French decided to march this 500 kilometers through scrub and desert. And they had 18,000 men in their expeditionary force, and half of them would perish on the march. Over 9,000 people would die of black water fever and malaria, and only 25 of them actually died in combat. So it was a desperate campaign. And there are still signs of it now. On my journey back, as I followed the ghostly army, as it were, I would come across a place where I knew there'd been a battle. I knew where the Malagasy positions and artillery ought to have been. So I would climb up this buttress of rock onto a hill above a town, scrape away at the dirt. And as you can see from the little picture there, all this Victorian battlefield junk would suddenly appear. Bits of china and belt buckles and so on. And having been researching this for 3 years, it's that sort of moment which I find really rewarding. It gets me very excited. Next, please. So the French did leave an impression on this island. They built railways and few roads, not very much. They were there for such a short period at only 65 years. But one of the things they did do is they fortified one of the greatest natural harbours in the world at Diego Suarez. And these gun emplacements which you see here were built in about 1900 and were never used until the Second World War, when, of course, the British wrestled Madagascar from the French. And the only time, Vichy French that is, And so the only time these guns were ever really used was in May 1942, fighting our people. But they're still there, and they've still got the guns inside them, and it's all that's left of this extraordinary miniature sideshow of the Second World War. Next, please. And of course, the 20th century wasn't really a very happy century for either the French or the Malagasys. The French tried to encourage the Malagasys to build their own infrastructure, to build roads and railways. And the Malagasys could never see the point of this. And work in this form was very novel to them, and they were really not interested in complying. So the result of all of that was the French had to then dragoon them into these massive work gangs. And it was really something akin to, well, another variant of slavery, really. But they did build things. And one of the things they built, and really the only railway that still survives, is the Fianarantsoa East Coast Railway. A wonderful trip, dropping 100 kilometers through the jungle as it descends the eastern escarpment. And interesting, the trains today are old ski trains that have been donated by the Swiss, and you can still find the sort of ski maps inside them. Next, please. So Madagascar will continue to surprise us into the future. It's quite a thought that the population now is 26 million, but within the next generation, it's thought that it will rise to 130 million. And Malagasys will rise to this challenge with ingenuity and resourcefulness. Already, they're demonstrating great skill in their adaptation to technology despite their poverty. And in Tana, the capital city that is, already some 50,000 people work in the business of either call centers, work sent from Morocco and from France, or in data processing. So if you've used French Deliveroo and you weren't happy with the service and you complained to customer services, the chances are your complaint will be dealt with by a Malagasy, and it'll be dealt with great charm. And I love that idea that there's this country that's been exporting misery in the shape of slaves for so many hundreds of years, and it's now exporting its charm. But it's the technology that they embrace, which I also find so fascinating. And already Madagascar has the best 4G internet in Africa, and some 2 million Malagasys are on Facebook. And that's for me, that's a very curious thought, that all that modernity and that technology, that beginning of that, in a country where you can still eat a chameleon that's been killed by a spear. Next, please. So thank you for joining me on this little armchair trip around Madagascar. And I hope that you enjoy this wonderful country as much as I have. Madagascar may be mystifying, but there's no better place in the world to be happily lost. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
And Ed, I'll take any questions.
I've got a couple. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I've never been to Madagascar. I'd love to go. Gosh, how interesting. Yeah, I'm going to ask you actually, maybe right at the beginning of the meeting, Jeremy asked you a quick one here about pronunciation of the name. How do the locals pronounce the name of their country?
Madagascar.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and it's Malagasy. Is that you never talk about Madagascans? It's Malagasys. So, and you don't use the French word Malgache. They really hate that. So try and avoid it. Yeah,
yeah. And then I'm gonna, if you're looking at the chat, I can see Ian Clarkson asked you about a comment that David Attenborough made the other day about exploitation, which you touched upon. And the changes in the last 20 years. And firstly, he said, what steps are being taken to prevent it? And are there, as a result, any no-go areas?
This is a really difficult issue. There's no doubt about it that Madagascar is being degraded rapidly. Something like 500,000 hectares a year disappear. And it's really difficult to control. particularly in times of chaotic government. And there have been periods over the last 20 years of real chaos. And when that happens, the corruption, the bribery goes mad, and all the rosewood trees get plucked out, and it's just a disaster. The other thing that happens is the plundering of animals. You may not have known, but the illegal export of animals is second only to the drug trade in terms of worldwide illegal trade. And again, it's disastrous for Madagascar. But Madagascar is a big place. There is a lot left, a lot of forests, a lot of animals. There's still a lot to see and enjoy. And one can only hope that the process of degradation is stopped before it's too late. And I think there will come a time when for Malagasys, a lemur running around is worth more than one in a pot or in a cage. And that time will come, and I just hope it's not too long. So I'm not pessimistic, necessarily unduly pessimistic about the future for this lovely country. I think there's a lot going for it still.
Thanks, John. And just on the subject of the things coming from animals, in the preliminary online question, someone asked me, Darren actually asked me, has COVID had much impact in Madagascar? Do you know?
Yeah, COVID has had quite an impact there, but it's not nearly as bad as here. And it may be for lots of reasons, and we don't know why ours is so bad, but it may be they have lower rates of diabetes, lower rates of obesity. It may be that they have a better immune system because they're used to it. It may be that because they're a less mobile society, it doesn't transfer quite as well. But nonetheless, it was bad. Lockdown was impossible in Tana because people are too poor to store food. So they have to go out every day to make a living and to acquire food. There was another curious effect of it all, and that is people were very worried they were going to die. And if you think you're going to die and you're Malagasy, that means you've got to get back to the family tomb. So this caused an exodus of people desperate to get out of Tana and get back to the village so they could be near the tomb in case they died. Not frightened of dying, just frightened of not being near the tomb. So that meant the army and police had set up roadblocks all around Tana, stopping people trying to get back to their village. It's just an extraordinary spectacle. The sea was also regarded as a refuge from COVID. A lot of people tried to flee to the sea because they thought that that would protect them.
Thanks, that's really interesting. And I've got a couple more on the chat here. Mary Rust has asked, please could you say a little, and I hope I pronounced this right, because the only zebu I know are cattle, maybe they're related, about the importance of zebu, or zebu.
They call it zebu. So yeah, as I said, I think I mentioned there are 11 million cattle in the country. They're very important. They tend to be on the coast. The cattle business tends to be more Afro-Malagasy than Asian Malagasy. Asian Malagasy dominate the rice business. The zebu are, to Western taste, a pretty unappetizing, stringy, muscly creature, but they're great survivors. They can live in these very, very difficult conditions. Down in the south, they tend to eat mostly cactus, particularly in times of drought. But as I say, it's not a particularly appetizing meat. During the First World War, a lot of zebu meat was sent to the Western Front, and French soldiers used to call it monkey. So it gives you some idea of what it was like. But yeah, it's really important, and unfortunately, it causes these mini wars everywhere. Sad.
Yeah, fantastic. Oh, if I'd known it was zebu the cattle, I could have gone on about that and the number of sweat glands they have per square inch as well. I could have helped you out there, John. Anyway, now a couple of questions here about Chinese investment, and I know. When I was in Namibia 2 years ago, I was amazed by the amount of Chinese investment there, and the positive and negatives were worrying things. Any comments on that as far as Madagascar goes?
Yeah, the Chinese have quite a prominent presence in Madagascar. So they've donated the big sports hall in Tana. They've rebuilt a lot of roads, and to their credit, they've really done more than many other governments, including European and American governments and so on. So they're quite a presence. It does, of course, come at a price. They want something out of it, almost certainly minerals, materials to fund their own, to feed their own industrial revolution. And the loans that they give are not exactly soft loans. These are proper commercial transactions. But meanwhile, they keep quite a low profile at the moment. You don't see a lot of Chinese around, but you know it. There are signs everywhere for construction companies and so on. I think one of the interesting developments when I was there was the announcement that there had been this trade deal between China and the Malagasy government in tourism. And the deal is for 250,000 Chinese a year to come to Madagascar. And so really, Madagascar will be a sort of Benidorm for the Chinese in the years to come. Should we worry about that? Well, I don't think so, not really. I mean, good for Madagascar. They need it. There's plenty of room. There's plenty of room for 250,000 tourists on the coast. So I don't think it's a real worry. But if you want to see Madagascar before all that happens, well, go now.
Yeah, fascinating and interesting that the only Latin American country with that never came to anything was Cuba. They were going to do this very similar thing. Now, two questions that were asked, people put on their registration, which basically said the same thing. Rachel and David, if you could go to one area of Madagascar, which would it be and why?
That's a really good question. And it's a really difficult one to answer because, as I said, I enjoyed so much of this country. But there is one place that I sort of probably like best, and it's called the Isalo Massif. And it's towards the southwest. And it's this area of mountains which was formed millions of years ago, actually as a sort of inland sea or karoo. And it filled with silt and sand. And then they compressed. And then when the Earth's tectonic plates shifted, this thing popped out. And it sort of popped out of the planet like an enormous fruitcake, 100 kilometers across. And so it means you've got this structure a bit like Monument Valley, but just vast. And it's these mountains that just rise up in front of you. And you can climb up onto the top of them. There's a plateau up there. And the creatures up there are as weird, if not weirder, than anywhere else. And the humans that live up there, or have lived up there, are equally fascinating because they're the Bara tribe predominantly. And they have this great thing of creating aerial tombs. So they will climb up these cliffs and plant the dead in these tiny caves, often at peril of their own life. So it's a really spectacular environment. And very beautiful place. So yeah, go there. I mean, the other great thing about it is there's two lovely French hotels built by a paratrooper who came in the 70s and stayed. And he's created two sublime hotels, beautifully sort of inserted into the rock around the Isalo. One of my favorite places, lovely.
Oh, fantastic. Now, just stepping back, I must apologize to Philippa because I missed, she asked the question twice. What mining is there, John?
Well, I think there's quite a lot going on at the moment. Phosphates, nitrates, and all sorts of things like that. There's copper. There's this nickel ore pipeline that runs down the escarpment. The Canadians built it. And they actually pump the slurrified nickel down this pipeline. And of course, it really gets the Malagasys chatting because they think it's gold inside the pipeline. A lot of them do. And they think their wealth is being sort of sucked out of them by the Canadians. But actually, it's a good earner for the country. It will undoubtedly have done some environmental damage. They need the money. They desperately need the money. Whether it's actually trickling down is another matter. You're going to hear a lot more about mining. Rio Tinto, Chinese companies, they're all there. Madagascar's got not just the nickels and so on, but also the rare earths that we all need for our mobile phones. So yeah, there's going to be a bit of it, I'm afraid.
Thanks, John. And maybe just getting towards the end now, but a couple of questions on tourism related. Firstly, is there a best time of year? If so, what it is to go? And any particular sort of guidebooks that you found useful?
I went in August, and I think August is a really great time. And that's fantastic, because actually a lot of the rest of the world is quite difficult to go to in August. It's very crowded, or Asia has its monsoons and so on. But actually August is a lovely time to go there. The temperature is about right in the west. It's not too hot. You can really enjoy some of these extraordinary port cities, or head inland and go look for lemurs and so on. So yeah, I'd go for August. But actually, probably Madagascar is a year-round destination, in the sense there's probably always somewhere where the temperature's just about right. This comes back to the thing, it is just vast. So, you know, there's that. As to guidebooks, probably the best one, head and shoulders above the rest, are the Bratt guides. Because Hilary Bratt has been going to Madagascar for, well, 30 odd years, perhaps more than that. And there's no one knows the country better than her. New edition by Daniel Austin, pretty good stuff.
Fantastic, yes, yes. Hilary, yeah, a bit of a star really, isn't she? Yeah. Fantastic. Well, look, I'm just gonna go on to my next slide here. So you have time to look at it. And John, I am going to ask you a final question. Because Tim has asked me, do you ever go back, or have you been back to the countries you wrote your early books about? And he specifically mentioned Paraguay, which I think is a fantastic example, because I can't quite remember when you wrote the Inflatable Pig, but it must be a while ago now. And I don't know if you've been back recently, because as he says, and I absolutely agree, it must have changed incredibly.
Do you know, sadly, I don't go back. And I don't go back because I suppose being a travel writer, you're a bit like a shark, really. If you stop swimming, you drown. And I always feel I had to sort of keep moving and exploring new places. But, you know, I really regret that in some ways. I really regret not going back to Paraguay and Guyana. If for no other reason than I had a lot of friends there during this time, and I miss them, and I still email them and so on, and I have lots of news about Paraguay, and yeah, it's changed enormously, but I would like to go and see it for myself. I feel very affectionate towards Paraguay and also Guyana. So no, I don't go back, but yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. And have they changed? Of course, hugely. Yeah. It was 20 years ago, Paraguay. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, amazing, isn't it? Thank you so much, John. That was absolutely fascinating, and I can see that the comments in the chat are echoing that view. If you can't see them, I'm just going to stop my screen share. I hope all of you have noticed that next week, at this time of day, I will be talking about Bernardo O'Higgins, fascinating character. And then the week after that, we've got Michael Cochrane, the great grandson of Admiral Cochrane, who helped liberate Chile, which should be really interesting. So I think there we are. Everyone can see each other. And John, as I say, thank you. And if everyone would be very welcome to unmute themselves and show their appreciation in the tradition.
And thank you, Ed, for asking me along and for all your help over the years. We've had such fun together.
Absolute pleasure. Yeah,
lovely to see you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.